Hello, everybody. My name is Kevin Casada, and today I'm going to talk to you about glaciers melting. So, when the glaciers are melting, we all know that the sea levels rises, and a lot of people may not know this, but that can affect Houston in a lot of ways. Since Houston is so close to the coast, the sea level rising means that Houston can eventually sink, especially because we have a bayou, Buffalo Bayou, which runs straight through the middle of Houston and goes all the way to the Gulf. So here we can see that sea levels that are rising post-glacial meltings, which means that once the glaciers are all melted, pretty much everything can be underwater. So going back to the sea levels, actually, in Houston, a lot of things that it can affect are the buildings, the skyscrapers that we have, the plants, and the animals that we also have. And I know we may not see a lot of animals in the city, but around it, there's animals like deer, rabbits, birds. It affects all those type of animals, especially because since they would have to leave their habitats and all their resources here, it would eventually lead them to go up north or someplace that doesn't have their resources. The Arctic animals are also in danger because there are a lot of animals that live in the Arctic poles, in Antarctica and in the North Pole. One of the main ones it can affect is the polar bears, because they need to be on land in order to survive. And without them being on land means that they can go straight into the water. They wouldn't have any support, and animals can just go and attack them. Same thing with the penguins and with the seagulls and with the Arctic fox. Although the birds that can fly away doesn't mean that they're safe. They would have to leave their habitats and they would go somewhere that's warmer than the Arctic, which eventually would lead them to either adapt or to die off. Now we have the plants. Although we may not think of it, in the Arctic there's many plants that are affected by the glaciers melting. They're supported by the glaciers, and without them, they would eventually just die off. Because the plants cannot live underwater, especially because it's salt water and it's not fresh water. These Arctic plants have been there for decades and maybe even centuries. But without the coldness of the glaciers and the temperature, then they would eventually die off. And here in Houston, we have those plants. Well, not these exactly, but we have plants and crops that we need to grow in order to keep our economy going. But not only that, the farmers and agricultural industries would start to decrease because there's no crops that we can grow because of the lack of plants. And with that being said, as the sea levels rise, they also bring in the salt water with them, which the plants need fresh water in order to survive. And Houston being so close to the Gulf, they would only get salt water, which they would have to adapt to. But eventually, it would be very hard for us to grow crops, specifically here in Houston, with only salt water. So this is how it would change our economy. And as we get into the economy, our economy is supposed to start decreasing, and ours, as in Houston, is supposed to be decreasing towards 2080. And once it hits 2080, it's going to be 0.07 or 0.7 drop of GDP, which means eventually all the companies would start decreasing and we would not have any profit in Houston, which would run out people looking for jobs and farmers especially and petroleum engineers. Everybody would eventually have to leave. And as you can see on my right side, we have agricultural yields. That just means that those places, the places in red, are the ones that are not going to be able to grow any crops or be able to sell anything because they just don't have any resources of land. As up in the north, where they're not so close to the coast, they will have opportunities to have more agricultural growth rather than in Florida, Texas, and especially Houston, since it's, as you can see, it's very dark red. And that just means that the Gulf rising would cause a lot of problems for our agriculture. And on the left side, you can also see that the sea levels will not only affect agriculture, but it would affect the cities completely. It would completely destroy Houston, as in the fact that the sea levels rising would eventually start going to the buildings, and there's no way that we can move the buildings. There's no way we can move our freeways. Anything in Houston would just start to completely drown underwater. This is a picture after Hurricane Harvey towards the coast. Now, I bring this up because recently Hurricane Harvey has affected many lives and has left people without houses, without jobs, without corporations that they built, without a lot of things. And the reason I bring this up is because as sea levels rise, the more natural disasters there are, the harder it is for us to rebuild and the harder it is for us to get the water out of our cities, which is exactly why Houston is in danger, because they have Buffalo Bayou going straight through the middle in the Gulf. And if the sea levels are rising and there's a natural disaster like Hurricane Harvey, then it'll take more than days to eventually get the water out of Houston. Here's a map of the floodways of Houston. As you can see, they all lead towards Buffalo Bayou, which is around this area. And we have two reservoirs that once they fill up with water, they have to let go. Now, we saw these during Hurricane Harvey, and when they let them go, they caused more problems. They caused more floodings in different areas. But it was the only way for us to let them go and actually control the flow of water. Because if we let them burst, then it would just completely destroy houses around it, anything without preparation. And we needed that preparation in order to get the water flowing naturally into the bayou. Now, this is a picture of Houston, and as you may not see, right here was the main attraction. Well, that was Hurricane Harvey was attracted to that part, especially because of the cold front and the warm front. They were just keeping Harvey stationary. Now with Harvey, we got 275 trillion pounds of water in Houston. That's a lot. That covered the whole city. And with that, it was so heavy that Houston actually sank 2 centimeters. And we may not think of much of 2 centimeters, but eventually those numbers start adding up. And if they start adding up 2 centimeters at a time, we can eventually start getting closer and closer to sea level and eventually start being underwater. And another thing about this is the glaciers melting. Leading to this, If the Greenland glaciers completely melted, just the Greenland ones, that would cause 23 feet of water to rise. Now, 23 feet would cover Houston. It would cover any city along the coast, and it would eventually make the US smaller because those cities would just be completely underwater. And that would hurt the whole economy. That would hurt like millions of people. Everything around us would just be underwater. We wouldn't be living here anymore. We would have to find places up north, start migrating somewhere else, which would hurt everybody in general, not just the people that live on the coasts, because all the cities would start getting cramped. Now, it's very hard for us to imagine the glaciers actually shrinking completely. But what we don't know is that the more pollution, the more global climate change that there is, the more the temperature is increasing inside the atmosphere, will cause the glaciers to eventually start increasing rapidly in melting. And that affects all of us, as I have explained to you. So instead of our glaciers naturally during the summers just melting little by little, this global climate change would speed it up and cause the glaciers to eventually melt thousands of years before it could have been. It is very important for us to control global climate change, because if not, we can be in very much danger, especially Houston being a coastal city. This is why it's very important to keep the glaciers running and not melting at a rapid rate. Thank you guys so much for listening to my presentation.